The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the open field. A cool breeze whispered through the trees, rustling the golden blades of grass that stretched endlessly beyond the wooden fence. Beyond that fence stood the horse. It wasn't just any horse. The townspeople watched from a distance, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. No one went near that horse. Not anymore. The massive black stallion stood alone, its muscular frame tense, its dark eyes scanning everything around it. The stories about it were legendary. Some whispered it had thrown its last rider, others claimed it was impossible to tame. It had once been prized, but something had changed. Now, it was unpredictable, dangerous, and untouchable. Until today. A girl stepped forward. She was young, yet there was no hesitation in her movement. Her boots crunched against the gravel as she slowly pushed open the creaking gate and stepped inside the fence. Gasps erupted from the small crowd gathered near the barn. "What is she doing?" someone murmured. "Doesn't she know?" An older man, wearing a worn-out rancher's hat, stepped forward, his face set in deep lines of concern. He had seen this before. He had watched as people, brave ones, foolish ones, had tried to tame that horse. They had all failed. But the girl didn't seem to care. With careful steps, she moved closer. The stallion stiffened. Its ears flicked forward, nostrils flaring, muscles coiling as though ready to bolt or attack. But she didn't stop. Her hand lifted ever so slightly, palm open, fingers relaxed. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. The old man clenched his jaw. He had seen that look in the stallion's eyes before, the raw energy, the barely contained rage. The girl was inches away from danger, but she didn't flinch. Then, suddenly, the horse reared back. A collective scream rippled through the onlookers. Hoofs struck the air, dirt kicked up, and the powerful stallion let out a sharp, ear-splitting whinny. But the girl didn't run. She didn't even move. The crowd braced for the worst, waiting for that inevitable disaster. Then something happened that no one expected. The horse landed, and stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. The girl lifted her hand just a little higher. And to everyone's shock, the horse took a step forward. A hush fell over the field. The dust from the stallion's hooves still lingered in the air, caught in the golden sunlight. No one spoke. No one even breathed. The girl stood motionless, her hands still outstretched. And then, against everything people had come to expect from this horse, it moved closer. The stallion's eyes remained locked on her, dark and calculating. It took slow, deliberate steps, muscles rippling beneath its glossy coat. There was no anger in its movement, no wild defiance. It was curious. The old man watching from the fence tightened his grip on the wooden rail. His face was unreadable, but his weathered hands betrayed his nerves. "That's not possible," he muttered under his breath. The horse had never let anyone near since the incident. Since that day, it had been nothing but pure rage, lashing out at anyone who dared approach. And yet, here it was, choosing to step forward. The girl, still calm, didn't retreat. One step. Another. The stallion's breathing was deep, controlled, measured. The air between them crackled with something unseen, something unspoken. A murmur ran through the small crowd gathered near the barn. "How is she doing that? Did she drug it? Is she crazy?" A younger man scoffed. "She's gonna get hurt. That horse doesn't let anyone near it." But as the girl took one final step, bridging the last bit of distance between them, the stallion lowered its head. Another wave of gasps rippled through the watchers. The girl reached out. Her fingertips barely grazed the stallion's muzzle, and for the briefest second, it didn't pull away. Instead, it stayed still. Then, a single exhale. Deep, slow, deliberate. The stallion let her touch it. The old man's eyes narrowed. He had spent decades working with horses, and he had never seen anything like this. This was not normal. And more than that, something about this girl was familiar. His mind raced back. Where had he seen her before? There was something in her stance, in the way she moved, that triggered a long-buried memory. Then, suddenly, the stallion flinched. Its muscles tensed, hooves shifting uneasily in the dirt. The girl froze, her breath caught. Something had changed. The wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass. A distant sound, something sharp, metallic, rang out from the barn. And just like that, the stallion reacted. With a powerful jolt, it reared up again, hooves slashing the sky, eyes wild with fear. The girl barely had time to move. The crowd gasped. The moment of connection was gone. Now, it was chaos. The stallion bolted. Dust exploded around them as it tore away, muscles coiling like a spring. The girl stumbled back, but she didn't fall. The old man cursed under his breath. It's happening again. Again. The word hung heavy in the air. Because this wasn't the first time. And the girl? She knew exactly why. The stallion thundered across the open field, kicking up dirt as it vanished into the distance. The crowd erupted into hushed murmurs, some stepping back, shaking their heads. That's it, someone muttered. I knew it wouldn't last. She's lucky she didn't get trampled, another added. The old man near the fence didn't say a word. His sharp eyes remained on the girl, watching her closely. Because she wasn't scared. Most people would have scrambled backward, shaken from the near disaster. But she didn't flinch. She stood her ground, eyes locked on the fleeing stallion as if she already knew what would happen next. And then, something no one expected. She took off running after it. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. What is she doing? Is she out of her mind? The ranch hands near the barn started moving, grabbing ropes, preparing to intervene, but the old man lifted a hand. Leave her, he said, his voice low. But sir. I said, leave her. His eyes followed the girl, studying her every movement. She wasn't running wildly, she wasn't chasing blindly like a reckless fool. She was tracking. Her boots barely sank into the dirt as she sprinted across the uneven terrain. She dodged the dips and hollows of the land, moving like she had done this before. Like she knew this horse. The stallion was fast, faster than any person could ever hope to be. But it wasn't running to escape. It wasn't running out of rage. It was running because it was afraid. The girl could see it. She could feel it. There was a difference between a wild horse and a broken one. And this horse, despite all the stories, despite the fear people had about it, was broken. It ran in large circles, its powerful muscles flexing as it pounded across the field. It didn't head for the trees. It didn't even try to jump the fence. It stayed within the land it knew. The girl skidded to a stop near an old, weathered post, the same one where the stallion had once been tied. Memories flooded her mind. A day just like this one. A horse that had been different back then. A voice, someone's voice, telling her to be careful. And then, the accident. Her breath hitched, just for a second. The stallion turned sharply, its hooves sliding against the dirt, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Its head swung around, nostrils flaring, eyes darting between her and the familiar post. A memory sparked behind those dark eyes. It remembered, too. The girl lowered herself slightly, her fingers barely grazing the dirt. And then, ever so slowly, she reached into her pocket. The crowd was still watching from a distance, unaware of the moment happening right in front of them. The stallion pawed at the ground, uncertain. Its muscles were still coiled, ready to bolt again. But then, she pulled out a single object. A small, frayed piece of rope. Old, weathered, almost unrecognizable to most people. But the stallion saw it. Its ears flicked forward, its head lowering slightly. For the first time since she had stepped onto the ranch, the girl spoke. Soft. Gentle. Barely more than a whisper. I never forgot. The wind carried her words, barely reaching the stallion's ears. But somehow, it understood. And just like that, the stallion took one slow, hesitant step toward her. The stallion's step forward was slow, hesitant, but deliberate. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, watching from the fence line. Some leaned in closer, unable to believe what they were seeing. The horse that had been untouchable for so long, the one that no one could break, was choosing to step toward her. The girl didn't move. She remained crouched, her fingers gently curled around the old, frayed rope. She held it with reverence, like it was something sacred, something that meant more than just an old piece of tack. Because it did. It was the same rope that had once tied this horse to a different life. A different time. A time before the fear. The stallion's nostrils flared as it inhaled the scent of the rope, and for a split second, the old man watching from the fence thought he saw something, a flicker of recognition in its dark eyes. The girl spoke again, barely above a whisper. "It's okay." The horse took another step. Then another. The space between them shrank, the tension in the air thick enough to stop hearts. She let the rope slide slowly through her fingers, holding it out just a little. Not to capture. Not to restrain. To remember. The stallion lowered its head just an inch more, just close enough that she could feel its breath against her skin. The warmth of it was real, grounding. And then, the impossible happened. The stallion pressed its nose against her hand. The entire crowd froze. Not a single person dared to speak. Even the old man, the one who had seen everything, had trained countless horses, had watched this animal lose itself, even he looked stunned. This wasn't just a moment. It was a connection. A fragile thread of trust that had been severed long ago, and was somehow, against all odds, being repaired. The girl exhaled slowly, steadying her voice. "I know what they say about you," she murmured. "But they don't know what really happened, do they?" The stallion didn't move away. It stayed. The wind shifted, kicking up the dust around them. The crowd was still locked in silent awe, but the girl and the horse existed in a world of their own. And for the first time, the girl allowed herself to remember. The accident. The one that changed everything. The sound of hooves pounding in panic. A voice screaming. A moment of terror. And the guilt. The girl clenched her jaw, feeling the weight of it pressing against her chest. She had spent years running from this moment, from this truth. And now, standing in front of the horse she once knew, the horse she once loved, she realized something. She wasn't just here to fix it. She was here to fix herself. A sudden sharp noise, a rusted gate slamming against a post, shattered the moment. The stallion flinched, ears pinning back, muscles tensing as if to bolt again. The girl's heart jumped, fear flashing in her eyes. Not now. Not when they had come this far. She did the only thing she could. She reached out, and grabbed hold of the stallion's mane. The breath of the crowd caught in their throats. Would the horse accept her touch, or reject it violently? For a heartbeat, time stood still. And then, the stallion did something no one expected. It stayed. The girl's fingers curled into the stallion's thick, tangled mane, bracing for the worst. She had made a mistake. She had acted on instinct, but now, she realized what she had done. She had crossed an invisible line. If the horse panicked, if it reared or bolted, she had no way of stopping it. And yet, the stallion didn't run. It stood still. The crowd, still watching from a distance, didn't dare move. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself didn't want to disturb the fragile moment between them. The old man near the fence narrowed his eyes. This wasn't luck. Something was happening here, something deep. The stallion lowered its head slightly, its ears twitching as if trying to listen, not just to the sounds around them, but to the girl herself. The girl swallowed hard, keeping her voice steady. "It's okay," she whispered. She gently ran her fingers down the horse's neck, feeling the warmth of its coat beneath her touch. It wasn't just muscle and power, it was something alive, something that had suffered, something that had been lost in its own way. She understood that feeling. The stallion took in a slow breath, its massive chest rising and falling in time with hers. This wasn't just a horse. It was a reflection. A soul trapped in its past, carrying wounds that had never healed. The girl blinked away the sting in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I know what happened." The stallion's ears flicked back, slightly. It felt her words. A new energy crackled in the air, not fear, not anger, but something different. Recognition. A memory buried deep, surfacing for the first time in years. The old man watching from the fence finally spoke, his voice low. "She's not just some girl," he murmured. The younger ranch hand beside him frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man didn't answer. Because he was starting to remember. Something about her stance. Her voice. The way she wasn't afraid even when she should have been. Something about the past. The stallion let out a slow, shuddering breath, one that wasn't just a release of air, but of something deeper. And then, it did the impossible. It nudged her. The crowd gasped. Not in aggression. Not in warning. But in trust. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. The girl closed her eyes for just a second, letting the moment settle into her bones. She had spent years running from this place. From this horse. From this truth. And now, standing here, with her hand against the stallion's strong neck, she knew. She had finally come home. But before she could take another breath, a loud voice shattered the silence. "Step away from the horse." The spell was broken. The girl's eyes snapped open as the stallion's muscles tensed again. The crowd shifted, whispers rippling through them. A man was approaching from the barn, his footsteps heavy with authority. The girl recognized him instantly. And the look in his eyes said one thing. She wasn't supposed to be here. The stallion's body tensed beneath her touch, its dark eyes snapping toward the man approaching from the barn. The voice was sharp, commanding, cutting through the thick tension that had just begun to settle. "Step away from the horse." The girl's grip on the stallion's mane tightened for just a second before she slowly lowered her hand. The man stalking toward them wasn't just any bystander. He was the owner of this land. The one who had locked this horse away from the world. And judging by the look on his face, he wasn't happy. Murmurs swept through the crowd as he stormed across the field, boots kicking up dry dust with every step. His voice was controlled, but his anger was undeniable. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he snapped. The girl squared her shoulders, but didn't back away. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, the old man at the fence finally stepped forward, his weathered face unreadable. "She's doing something no one else could," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it. The ranch owner's eyes flicked to him, sharp and suspicious. "No one told her to be here," he shot back. "She's trespassing." A younger ranch hand muttered under his breath, "I mean, it's not like she hurt the horse." The ranch owner's gaze darkened, but he didn't argue. Because he had seen it too. He had seen the way the stallion had chosen to stay near the girl. How it had lowered its head instead of charging away in fear or fury. How, for the first time in years, it had allowed someone to touch it. He clenched his jaw. "Doesn't matter," he finally said. "That horse isn't safe. It hasn't been for a long time." His voice dipped lower, the weight of his words heavy. "It'll never be." The girl's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face calm. She knew this fight wasn't just about the horse. It was about the past. Her past. His past. Because this wasn't just any ranch. And this wasn't just any horse. This was once her home. Her fingers curled into her palm. She had promised herself she would never come back here. That she would never face this again. But now, standing before the man who had tried to erase her from this place, standing beside the horse who had once been everything to her, she realized something. She wasn't leaving. Not this time. That day, years ago, she continued, when the stallion threw his rider, when everyone said he was too wild, too untamable, you let them believe it. The ranch owner's breath hitched. But that wasn't the truth. A hush fell over the crowd. The old man by the fence exhaled slowly. Now, he remembered. The accident. The moment everything changed. The stallion hadn't been wild. He had been betrayed. The girl turned back to the horse, her eyes filled with something deeper than just understanding, regret. She swallowed the lump in her throat. I was there, she said. I saw what happened. The ranch owner's shoulders stiffened. Because he had seen it, too. And now, the truth he had buried for years, was finally about to be spoken. The stallion let out a deep, slow breath, pressing its nose against the girl's hand. And at that moment, everything changed. Because the past wasn't just a memory anymore. It was finally being set free. The air in the field was thick with silence. No one dared to speak. The girl stood beside the stallion, her fingers brushing its coat, the weight of the past pressing heavy against her chest. The ranch owner's face was set in stone, but his eyes told another story. A story of fear. Of guilt. Because he knew. He knew the truth was about to come out. The girl's voice was steady when she finally spoke. That day, she said, looking at the stallion, not him. I was there. I saw everything. A ripple of unease swept through the crowd. Some glanced at each other, brows furrowed, waiting. Waiting for the secret that had been buried for so long. The ranch owner stepped forward. Don't, he warned, voice sharp, but there was a crack in it now. A flicker of desperation. The girl lifted her chin, locking eyes with him. You lied to them, she said. You let them believe the stallion turned on his rider. That he was a danger. That he was beyond saving. The old man near the fence exhaled deeply. He knew something hadn't been right back then. But this was worse than he had imagined. The girl turned back to the crowd. That's not what happened. The stallion shifted beside her, muscles twitching, but he didn't run. Because he remembered, too. And finally, after all these years, someone was telling the truth. She took a breath, grounding herself. The day of the accident, he wasn't running wild. She paused. He was running because someone. Her eyes flicked to the ranch owner. Whipped him. Gasps echoed from the onlookers. The ranch owner's face paled. That's a lie. The girl shook her head. No. It's not. She turned back to the stallion, running her hand over its neck, feeling the ridges of old scars no one had ever bothered to explain. I remember hearing the snap of the whip. I remember seeing him rear up, panicked, terrified, because he didn't understand why he was being hurt. And I remember, her voice cracked, just for a second. I remember the rider pulling too hard on the reins, trying to force him down, and that's when he fell. The stallion let out a long breath, as if he had been holding on to that memory, too. The crowd stood frozen. Processing. Because if what she was saying was true, then everything they had believed about this horse, everything they had feared, had been a lie. The ranch owner's jaw clenched. You don't know what you're talking about. The girl met his gaze, unshaken. You wanted to break him. Her voice was softer now, but not weak. But you didn't understand him. She turned back to the horse, her fingers trailing down his face, her voice barely above a whisper now. He never wanted to fight, she said. He just wanted to be free. The stallion nuzzled against her palm. The ranch owner swallowed hard, his fists still clenched at his sides. But the truth was already out there. The old man near the fence sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Then, in a voice rough with age but steady with certainty, he said, She's right. The ranch owner's head snapped toward him. You don't know that. The old man's gaze was tired but knowing. I knew something didn't sit right with me that day, he admitted. The way the story was told. The way the horse reacted. I should have asked more questions. The younger ranch hands shifted uncomfortably. Because now, the cracks in the ranch owner's story were too wide to ignore. The girl took a step closer to the stallion, and for the first time in years, he didn't flinch. Didn't run. Didn't fight. Because he knew. He was finally safe. She let out a slow, trembling breath. This wasn't just about the stallion anymore. This was about redemption. About setting things right. And the girl knew. Tomorrow, everything on this ranch would change. Forever. A heavy silence lingered over the field. The weight of truth had settled in the air, undeniable, unshakable. The girl stood beside the stallion, her hand resting against its strong neck. The warmth of his breath, the steady rise and fall of his chest, everything about him felt alive again. The old wounds, the ones buried beneath his skin, and the ones buried inside his soul, were finally beginning to heal. And yet, the ranch owner still stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. Because his lies had unraveled. Because he was losing control. His voice was low, edged with something close to desperation. Even if what you're saying is true, he said, it doesn't change what happened. That horse still threw his rider. That fall nearly killed a man. The girl's fingers curled slightly in the stallion's mane. Yes, she said softly. But not because he was dangerous. Her voice was steady, firm. He was afraid. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. The stallion was never the monster. The monster was the fear that was forced into him. The ranch owner's face twitched. For the first time, he looked unsure. The old man by the fence sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. His voice was quiet, but final. She's right, he murmured. We failed him. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked away, ashamed. Because they all had played a part. They had believed the lie. They had let fear write the stallion's story, instead of the truth. And now, for the first time in years, they had a chance to rewrite it. The girl turned back to the stallion, watching the way he stood still beside her, trusting her. She reached into her pocket. And slowly, she pulled out the frayed old rope. The same rope that had once held him captive. The same rope that had once tied him to a past he couldn't escape. But now, she didn't tie it around him. Instead, she dropped it. The rope landed in the dirt between them, a symbol of letting go. She met the stallion's eyes, her voice soft but full of conviction. You don't have to carry this anymore. The stallion let out a slow breath, his ears twitching forward. Then, in a moment no one would ever forget, he stepped over the rope. The girl smiled. Not because she had tamed him. But because he had chosen freedom. The old man at the fence nodded, his weathered face breaking into a rare look of approval. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. The younger ranch hands looked on in awe. The whispers of fear had faded. In their place, there was only respect. Even the ranch owner had no words. Because in that moment, he realized. He had already lost. Not to the girl. Not even to the stallion. But to the truth. And truth had a way of rewriting everything. The girl ran her fingers down the stallion's neck one last time, before stepping back. She had done what she came here to do. The stallion was no longer a prisoner of his past. And neither was she. She turned to leave, but just as she reached the gate, she heard the soft sound of hooves. She glanced back. The stallion was following her. The crowd gasped. The ranch owner staggered back a step. Because for years, no one could get that horse to move. But now, he wasn't being forced. He was choosing. Choosing to trust. Choosing to start over. A lump formed in the girl's throat as she reached out one last time. This time, the stallion lowered his head into her hands. It was over. The past had finally let go. And as the sun set over the field, bathing the world in gold, the girl realized. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought with force. They're fought with patience, with understanding, and with the courage to face the truth. And when you do, even the most broken souls can heal. "You're wrong," she said quietly. The ranch owner's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" The girl lifted her chin, finally meeting his glare head-on. "You're wrong about him," she said, nodding toward the stallion. "He's not dangerous." The ranch owner scoffed. "That horse nearly killed a man." The girl didn't flinch. "And whose fault was that?" she asked. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. The ranch owner's face darkened, but he said nothing. Because they both knew the truth. The stallion hadn't just attacked that day. It hadn't been wild or untamed. It had been terrified. And the real reason why? Because of him. Because of what he had done. The past was creeping back to the surface, and now, with so many eyes watching, he had two choices. Deny it, or finally face it. The air between them crackled with tension. The stallion pawed at the dirt, its muscles coiled, sensing the shift in energy. And then, the girl took a step closer to the horse. A deliberate step. One that dared the ranch owner to stop her. She lifted a hand. The stallion, despite all the years of fear, despite all the damage that had been done, let her touch it again. The crowd gasped. And the ranch owner? For the first time, he looked afraid. Because he knew. The truth was about to come out. A charged silence settled over the field. The stallion stood motionless beneath the girl's touch, its dark eyes calm but watchful. The ranch owner clenched his jaw. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He knew what was coming next. And he wasn't ready. The crowd had been stunned before, but now, their curiosity turned into something deeper. Suspicion. Because the girl's words had struck a nerve. The stallion had not always been like this. There was a reason it had been locked away. A reason people feared it. And it wasn't just because it was dangerous. It was because someone made it that way. The old man near the fence studied the girl carefully. He could see the fire in her eyes now, the determination, the raw emotion pushing her forward. She wasn't here by accident. She had come back for the truth. The ranch owner took a sharp step forward. "That's enough," he snapped. His voice was lower now, more uncertain. But the girl didn't move. She ran her hand down the stallion's neck, her fingers brushing against old scars hidden beneath its thick coat. Scars that no one wanted to talk about. She had stayed silent about it for too long. Not anymore. She turned to face the ranch owner, her expression unreadable. "You never told them, did you?" she asked quietly. The wind shifted, rustling through the trees. The ranch owner's face darkened. "Told them what?" The girl didn't blink. That the accident wasn't his fault. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. The girl kept her voice steady, but everyone could feel the weight of her words.